Hi, my name is Bobbie Hayes. I'm a licensed mental health counselor and a certified addictions professional. I'm doing this video for a class that I teach at Nova, but I'm also going to use it to upload it to YouTube as part of an ongoing training that Clinical Therapy Associates offers for professionals and provides CEUs for it. Would be like a snapshot of a training that I would do. The purpose behind tonight's video is to talk a little bit about the models of addiction. There have been lots and lots and lots of different ideas about why it is that some people become addicts and some people don't. And so I wanted to talk about some of the different ways that have been identified. And I'm looking at a book called Substance Abuse Information for School Counselors, Social Workers, Therapists, and Counselors by Gary Fisher and Thomas Harrison. This is the book. And this is about chapter 3. And so one of the things that it says is that one of the beliefs that we have about addiction is that it's a moral issue. And that is that people who are involved in addictive behavior do so because of a personality flaw, that there's something wrong with who they are and their decision-making ability, and that they have the choice to be able to do it differently, and they choose not to because of what would be considered to be a moral flaw or a character defect. It's not really widely believed anymore that people adhere to that kind of model. However, it is one model that we use in the criminal justice system, and I'm not saying that in a rude way. Until a number of years ago, there was something that was called, at least in Florida, called a downward departure, which is that judges could depart from the mandatory sentencing of charges when somebody was convicted or pled no contest. They have a framework of which they're allowed to make decisions about how they're going to sentence people. And part of what the moral model says is that people had choices. They chose to do this behavior, whether it's selling drugs or driving under the influence or whatever, and they made a decision to do the wrong thing, to act on their addiction and to break the law. I remember one time I had a client who had gotten into an accident driving while she was on the influence of cocaine, and she was charged with vehicular manslaughter. And she asked me what that meant, and I remember looking at her and saying, they believe that you're responsible for the death of your daughter, but they don't think you did it necessarily on purpose. And the legal system is one that has to adhere to that, because by the time somebody gets into the criminal justice system, it's not really a time for them to be relying on a judge to say, oh, okay, you made a bad, you're sick, and so you need to get help. I remember one time a mom said to me when her daughter had been charged with DUI and she had been driving with her children in the car, and the mom said, I don't understand why the judge isn't going to give her rehab. And I said, because the time for her to get rehab was prior to her getting these charges. And so I think a lot of times we look at the criminal justice system and wonder why they're not doing something that's more treatment-based, but really, truly, their job is to be able to ensure the fact that our community is safe. And so they do have to approach it from a place that says, you had a different choice, you could have made a different choice, and you chose not to. The second model that's discussed is the socio-cultural model, and that is that cultural, ethnic, religious, and environmental conditions are causal factors in addiction. So if two people who come, take a person who comes from a fairly affluent family and somebody who comes from a very poor SES family, that one of the factors that may come into play is that somebody with a poor socioeconomical structure, background, may be more likely to get involved with acting out behavior, and consequently they make bad choices, or they're coming from families where there's an addiction, and not necessarily that they inherently developed a predisposition biologically to becoming an alcoholic, but rather it was a learned behavior that they learned from people in their family, or that their religious influence is one that may make an impact on their use of substances. Father Martin was a great speaker. He was a recovering priest. He passed away a number of years ago, really my mentor in life. But one of the things that he would say is that wherever you find four Irish Catholics, you always find a fifth, like a fifth, fifth with alcohol. But that, because being Irish, not only biologically may there be some factors in why that makes people more likely to become alcoholic, but that Irish Catholics tend to be overrepresented in addiction. So do Native American Indians. So there's a lot of, and some of that is really that's such a prevalent behavior on a reservation that gets to be like a learned choice. The third one is a psychological model. And I remember when I first got in the field, you couldn't get in the field if you weren't in recovery. And I'm not a recovering alcoholic, and I didn't want to become an alcoholic just to get a job. Figured that was a bit much. So I finally was able to work after I drove somebody crazy enough till he hired me. And one of the things that so that was very much in the addiction field. People who were involved in the field were people who had been in recovery. And then there was a switch. And the switch went from being to a place of this being a chemical dependency, and the people who worked in the field or people who had a background in living in a chemically dependent life, but that was treated as being a psychological disorder, so that it was secondary to depression, it was secondary to anxiety. And for a long time, mental health issues and substance abuse issues were treated separately, and that was really a problem because people did not get well that way. It is so true that so many people who have a substance abuse disorder may have a co-occurring mental health disorder. What comes first, the chicken and the egg? Who knows? Depending on your belief about how alcoholism and other addictions surface, it could be that alcohol, being predisposed to alcoholism, may be a characteristic that makes me more depressed than other people. There has been a lot of evidence that say that people who are chemically dependent who take antidepressants are oftentimes helped by that, because maybe their depression is the factor that led to their addiction. So, but the psychological model says that really that the secondary is that alcohol and drug use is a learned and reinforced behavior, but that the primary issue is something to do with mental health diagnosis. The disease model is one that gets to be very hot debate, and that is basically that addiction is a primary chronic and progressive disease, probably caused to a great extent by genetic predisposition. Because what we find is that if you have children who come from chemically dependent families, they are much more likely than their peers to develop a problem with substance abuse. And that is oftentimes believed to be like a genetic predisposition, so that when I got brown hair and brown eyes, because my dad was an alcoholic, I also may have gotten predisposition to becoming an alcoholic, which is why I don't drink. And that's, or that it skips a generation, so that my children would be at higher risk because my father was an alcoholic. The problem with the disease concept is it implies the fact that I'm a sick person and that I'm always going to be a sick person. The alcoholism as a disease model, or addiction as a disease model, says basically is that once you've developed this disorder, you'll always have it. And so that instead of saying I'm somebody that is used to be an alcoholic, the belief behind the disease model is that once I'm an alcoholic, I'm always an alcoholic. So I am, it's a lifelong disease, and that it can be exacerbated at any point, and that I can go into relapse, and that I can spend a good part of my life in remission, and some people spend their whole rest of their lives in remission, but that it's always something that is at risk for reoccurrence. Marty Mann, who is one of the first women associated with being Alcoholics Anonymous, I was listening to her CD before, and she was talking about the idea that she is, one thing she has to remember as a sober woman, she's deceased, but that she always had to remember as a sober woman, is that when there was somebody who was new to AA and they were coming in and had been drinking most recently, that she realizes that she's one drink away from being that person, and that she never can forget that, because that she has a disease that can get reactivated at any time. So that predisposition says that that I was born with an increased likelihood of becoming alcoholic because of my family factors. It also could be because of my cultural factors, and I'm not talking about it in terms of a learned behavior. I'm talking about it in terms of the fact that my body may not break down alcohol the same way that other people do because of my ethnic background. And the third one is this biopsychosocial model, and that says addiction is the result of multiple interacting variables, the strength of which may vary between individuals. It doesn't say that somebody could be a little bit chemically dependent. It doesn't mean that I either am or I'm not. There's some people who have developed a problem with alcohol and drugs, and they are able to stop. And there's been some studies that have indicated that possibly if they had a problem, but they weren't yet dependent on it, that they've been able to reverse and be able to use socially. That is really, really not very common and not really something I'd want to see anybody try out. After the Vietnam War, there was a bunch of vets that came back that had been abusing heroin in a problematic style when they were over in Vietnam. And strangely enough, when they came back, they didn't have the same problem. And that's really hard to be able to figure out. You know, that's probably getting back to some of the sociocultural things, that they were in an environment that was so horrific that they used heroin as a coping mechanism. And even though heroin can be very dependency causing, very addictive, the difference being dependency can be a psychological compulsion, and addiction can be a physical compulsion. So some drugs are, my body learns to adjust so that it becomes physically in need of that drug. And the absence of those drugs cause withdrawal symptoms. So alcohol is one of those, benzodiazepines is one of those, and opiates are one of those. Most other drugs are dependency causing, which means that I so believe with everything that I am that I have to get high, because if I can't, I feel like I'm going to die. But drugs that are addictive are drugs that if I don't use them and I just stop, that I am running the risk of going into a physical withdrawal symptom that could be very problematic. So the biopsychosocial model says that addiction is probably a result of a lot of interactive variables. And that's true. I think that there's a part with the biopsychosocial model that says, yes, there is some precursors that may be inherited. There are some environmental factors. There are some learned factors. That there are, it may become a coping mechanism. It may be something that's reinforced within my society or my culture. And that they all play in factor together. And that as a result of that, it causes people to develop a problem with alcohol and drugs. And so those are some of the different models. It's up to you as the reader of the book or people who are doing research into the area to take a look at what you believe to be true. But it becomes really important. The most important part, I think, is for us to begin to understand that no matter what we believe, that this is not something that people do because they're bad people. They do things that they don't necessarily want to do because they don't know how else to be able to do it. So this has been a brief overview of some of the different models of addiction, and I hope it's been helpful to you. My name is Bobbie Hayes. You can reach me at bobbie9616@gmail.com or hmurray@nova.edu if you have any questions or comments. Looking forward to hearing from you. Thanks. Have a good night. Bye.